This Steve Jones Show podcast is now loading. The Steve Jones Show podcast is presented by Sunbury Motor Company, Purdy Insurance, Brewers Outlet, and NIL Game Changers. Bringing you an in-depth look at Penn State sports and more. This is the Steve Jones Show on News Radio 1070 WKOK. The Steve Jones Show is presented by Sunbury Motor Company, Purdy Insurance, Brewers Outlet, and NIL Game Changers. Now from the Sunbury Motors studio, here's Steve Jones.
Great to be with you on this Tuesday as we get ready for later in the week, the blue-white game. Last night, the national championship game in men's basketball. This opening half hour brought to you by Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. Auto, home, life, business, boat, motorcycle, RV. They'll take care of your insurance needs, save you money wherever they can, whether it's going over state lines, whether it's bundles. They'll figure it out because customer service means everything to them. At Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury, go to purdyinsurance.com. And we're in the Sunbury Motors studio, Sunbury Motors, 4th Street in Sunbury. Sunbury Motors Kia, routes 11 and 15 in Hummel's Wharf, and online at sunburymotors.com. I don't know whether he's one street up from me or not right now. I'd have to find out. That would be one of my neighbors, Mark Brennan. Sir, welcome. It's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be here, Steve, and I think the recycling truck's about to go by, so if you hear some rattling out there may be some bottles clinging and stuff. You'll know I'm in your neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly, because they already hit my street. So, Mark, what have you learned to this point about Penn State football between people you've talked to and also the opportunities you've had to see practice?
I just think the depth that we're seeing the last couple of years, Steve, has been unbelievable. I mean, when you look at what Penn State has lost to the NFL draft at key positions, take defensive end. And, they obviously they're going to have a first-rounder in Chop, and I think Adisa did an unbelievable job for himself at the Combine and Pro Day. But then you look at what's coming back, and it's like, whoa. I mean, you add Abdul Carter to it. Denai Dennis Sutton was effectively a starter last year. Zariah Fisher, everything we're hearing is he's been one of the real standouts. Amin Vanover's played a lot. Jameel Lyons is turning heads. Smith Vilbert's back in the mix. Jalen Harvey. I mean, so when you talk about depth, you're losing really good players to the NFL, and I think that's going to be one of the good things for Tom Allen. It's a similar situation at cornerback where, you lose three guys. I think all are going to have a really good shot to play in the NFL. Daquan Hardy maybe as a special teams type guy, but you look at what they're bringing back and how they were able to supplement through the transfer portal with A.J. Harris and Kimber. And it's just like, wow. I mean, so that's the one thing I think I think offensive tackle is another position. They lose their two starting tackles, and then you look at what they have coming back, even without Drew Shelton, who's been banged up. But you look at Donko, you look at Ono, you look at Javen Williams, you bring Nolan Rucci in there. I mean, I know I'm throwing a lot of names out, but it wasn't that long ago that they didn't have this kind of quality depth. And I just think when you're a team that wants to fight to be in that playoff, which is going to be expanded now, and wants to fight to be a Big Ten champion, which is expanded now, and wants to be involved in all these things, quality depth is key, and I think they have it.
So you talked about what Tom Allen's doing defensively. You mentioned Carter going to defensive end. I think a lot of people pretty much know how Tom likes to play because they've seen it year after year. But what about Andy Kotelnicki? What have you learned on that side of the ball as to how he wants to play based on the personnel he has at Penn State?
Yeah, I mean, just from an X's and O's perspective, what Drew Aller has told us is they're doing a lot more quick things right before and right after the snap. It sounded almost as if they thought they were maybe getting a little bit stale last year and people were figuring out what they were going to do. But the thing that has stood out to me about Andy, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but listen, when an offensive coordinator is fired during the season, is let go during the season, that's a pretty good indication that there was a lack of communication kind of all around. And everything we're hearing about Andy and everything we get in talking to Andy, this guy is an unbelievable communicator. And I think that's half the battle as a coach. You know, one thing that Drew Aller said when we had a chance to talk to him during winter workouts, two things he said. One was that Kotelnicki would hit them with pop quizzes, the quarterbacks, just out of nowhere in Lash Building. So that's like, okay, he wants to keep the communication flowing. But the other thing, Steve, that really stood out to me, he said Andy Kotelnicki would go to the quarterbacks and other players and say, hey, what do you think is going to work? What do you like? And then, now he didn't take every one of those ideas and implement it, but he listened. He was a sounding board, and he could then explain, okay, well, maybe we could use this element of that, or maybe this is why this doesn't work. But to me, that's huge. And then I think you just see his dynamic in practice, where he's in the middle of everything. And I know you're at more practices than I am, but listen, for people who haven't been to football practice, I don't want to shock you, but you may hear some profanity every once in a while. And this guy is dropping F-bombs left and right. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean in a motivational type way. And he's in the middle of drills, whacking people with pads, and he's yelling at the running backs. And he's and I don't think we saw that with Mike Yurcich as much. I don't think we saw the interaction. So to me, Steve, as much as X's and O's are going to be important, I think that level of communication is, we've already seen it, and I think it's only going to get better and better and better.
They're swearing in practice. Okay.
A little bit. Well, you know, Steve, you know that there are some people who might hear that and be a little bit offended, but for somebody like me, obviously, it's not really a problem.
I told the story the other day. I'll tell you. Back when Bill O'Brien came in, you know, like Joe didn't swear. Okay.
Right.
Just that's, you know, and that was Joe's standard, and he didn't do it. So Bill O'Brien, of course, was, you know, and is, you know, great guy, but at the same time should be pointed out that he would throw some colorful language out there. So one day they're at practice, and they did something wrong. He's mad. He starts throwing language out there, and then he looks over at me and he says, if you don't like the swearing, you can leave. And I said, no, I do basketball.
Right, exactly. You're courtside, or when you are courtside, not necessarily at the Jordan Center, but when you are courtside, you tend to hear a lot of that. So, yeah. Hey, there's a really funny story, Steve, if I could tell it, but it was with Craig Fitzgerald. You know, his first couple of years as Penn State strength coach, I think it was the first year, second year, and I got to know him really well because he went to high school with Keith Conlon, who I'm friends with.
Sure.
And he was so they did a workout that they allowed us to videotape, and there was a lot of profanity in that. And I said, hey, do you mind if I post this? And he's like, no, go ahead. So I posted, and like one person complained about the profanity. So he calls me. He's like, oh, Mark, you know, maybe you should take that down. And I'm like, Craig, Fitz, I got to tell you, one person complained, 8,000 people are like, I love this guy. So I'm like, let me see if I can edit it a little bit. And we get off the phone, and 5 minutes later he goes, you know what, Mark, bleep it. Just leave it up. And so that video is up there somewhere in cyberspace to this day.
The blue-white game will be the 15th practice. So this will be practice 12 today, 13 on Thursday, 14 Friday, then 15 Saturday. What, if anything, are you looking for in this, especially in the first half?
I'm anxious, and I'm going to ask James about this today. I don't know if you have any insight on it, but, he had mentioned earlier in the spring that this is going to be the first time in a while that they'll have enough players to actually have something resembling an actual game, rather than the modified type scrimmages they've been doing. And I would just love to see that. I went and counted today because I was obviously had too much time on my hands, but, 124 players on the roster right now. Yeah. And a lot of that is owed to all the players who enrolled mid-year and the transfers who came in mid-year. That used to not be the case. I mean, you used to have a really depleted roster before this started to happen. So I think if they're able to have some kind of semblance of a game, I think that's going to be key. But otherwise, I think it's important to keep an eye on those young offensive linemen that I mentioned, and a guy like Cooper Cousins, who apparently, is just tearing it up for a true freshman, which is unheard of for an early enrollee. And then over on defense, I think the positions that I was talking about, when you lose so many players to the NFL, how are things going to shake down at defensive end, and how are they going to shake down at cornerback? Tom Allen, he didn't have these problems at Indiana where you almost have too much talent at defensive end. He told enough about his scheme out there where he had the two specialty positions, the Husky, which is now called the Lion, which is like a defensive back hybrid type thing, and then the Bull, which was a defensive end linebacker hybrid. So he explained the Husky/Lion to us at the media availability, and I said, well, what about the Bull? Are you going to implement that? He goes, we really don't have to, because the defensive ends here are athletic enough that they can do all the things that we were asking of that position, which includes dropping into coverage, moving all around, a lot of different things that Manny Diaz did with the defensive end. But it just goes to show you the difference in talent level, and now his challenges are going to be much different now, and fortunately he has a very experienced staff, and James Franklin has a very experienced defensive staff. What those guys on that side of the ball are like, including a guy like Deion Barnes, who's relatively young but has been with the program for multiple years now, to help him make all those decisions.
Right, and it's interesting because that's what I find interesting about Abdul Carter. We saw how good Adisa Isaac was, and I think it's going to be a big benefit to him at the next level when Penn State would run zone blitzes, because he knew how to drop into the right zone, the proper depth of a drop. Jack and I talked about it in the broadcast all the time. Having a guy that had been playing linebacker, now playing defensive end, I think allows you to keep that thought process in there. Right.
And then, Steve, it's a 250-pound guy. So you're not looking at – and that's where that hybrid thing came into play at Indiana, where that was probably going to be like a 225-pound guy.
Right.
And that's a whole different thing, because then they know what you're going to do. I mean, if you're bringing that guy in, you're probably going to drop him into coverage, right? Whereas with Abdul Carter – you don't know if he's coming off the edge. You don't know if he's dropping into coverage. You don't know what the heck he's doing. And he's not the only defensive end who's that athletic. I mean, I know I mentioned him earlier, but I am just telling people, watch out for Jameel Lyons. I don't know that he's going to be a starter this year, but I think that guy has big time written all over him. I mean, they have so much talent that I don't know that he's going to be a starter this year, but I think he's going to be really, really good as time goes by.
What kind of read have you had to this point on the quarterbacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to you're sensing more of a comfort level, at least from Drew Aller. I haven't had a chance to talk to Bo, so I can't speak on what his kind of feel for things are. But in terms of Drew, we had an opportunity to speak to him last week. I almost said last year. Last week on a Zoom call. And I just think the level of comfort and confidence he seems to have working with Andy Kotelnicki seems to be at a little bit different level than maybe it was with Yersich. And I'm hearing nothing but good things about Grunkemeyer. Obviously there's don't think we're going to see Smolik. Obviously I think there's some things going on there physically, but I think they're in a good spot with. I guess the question is going to be, Steve, is, are they going to be willing to use Bo as a change of pace type quarterback, which they did a little bit late last year. And I think if you go and you look at what Andy Kotelnicki has done in the past and the different types of quarterbacks he's been able to work with, I mean, I think that's one of his strengths, is that he's been very successful with multiple different kinds of quarterbacks, whether pure drop back or more mobile guys. And will it be a situation where he finds a way? I mean, that's one thing he said. He was asked specifically about Bo Pribula, and he's spoken more general terms. And he said basically, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote right here in front of me. Sure. If we think somebody could help us win, we're going to find a way to get them on the field. He said, if that means playing 8 tailbacks, I'll play 8 tailbacks. I mean, he was being facetious, obviously,
right,
but making the point that, so that's what I think is going to be interesting. They're not going to tip their hand in the blue-white game to that sort of thing, but I think when we get to fall camp and when we get to that season opener at West Virginia, how are they going to use Bo Pribula? Will they do it? Because he obviously brings a different skill set than Drew Aller.
All right, and the basketball season wrapped up last night. We are now into portal season and have been into portal season for a couple of weeks now. When you look at Penn State to this point, based on the season they had and the needs, especially in a league that's going to bring in 4 new schools, what's your thoughts on where Mike Rhodes is right now with the team?
Well, I think it was important to get the big guy from Xavier, obviously, given who they lost. And, they have another big guy coming in as a true freshman, but I think they still need to get, a little bit more size. We saw last year, what happened when you don't have enough big men. And one of them, they were already a little bit, not quite where they needed to be in terms of guys who can come in and make an impact. And then Meach gets hurt, and now you're in a really difficult spot. And I think at VCU, you can get by with that. In the Big Ten, you can't. The big men are just way, way, way too good. And so I think developing depth there is going to be really important. I think making sure that everybody else stays is very, very important as well. But to me, making sure I don't want to say it's easy to get smaller players who are really good, but I think it's easier than getting skilled big. So I think being able to get at least one more guy there would be really important for this team.
Right. Have you invested any time yet in the 4 schools coming in football and basketball, or is it just been a time where you're so locked into what Penn State is currently doing that you'll file that for a little bit later?
Yeah, it's been tough, Steve. And I'm to the point now where we're starting to make travel plans, and I'm just like dreading making those plans for USC. It's like, oh my God. I used to think going to Wisconsin was bad. And now I have to figure out a way to get to USC and back in time to tape our TV show. So I just haven't been able to dive into that just yet. I think after spring practice is going to be a good time to do that. And obviously with those teams out there, I don't know. You had some major coaching shakeups with those teams, with several of those teams. So I don't know. You're not really going to be able to look back at last year, I don't think, and figure out, what USC or what UCLA is going to be, or what Washington's going to be. So that's something I think after spring practice we'll dive into.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. You mentioned what you might talk to him about tonight in practice. Dev, do you know who you're getting besides James tonight?
We are getting Ty Howell. We are getting Terry Smith. And Dawkins. Yeah, so I think that's going to be cool to talk to Doc. He's one guy, Steve, I want to give a shout out to because, this because you're around the program. But from the time he was pretty young, people pointed to him as a leader in this program. Yep. And I think people who know what his dad was kind of all about understand where his personality comes from. I think a lot of it comes from his mom, too, who's an outgoing personality. But I just think it's a situation where I would keep an eye out for Nick Dawkins. I think he's, they're sizing him up as a guy who's going to take over for Hunter Norzad I think Cooper Cousins will probably push him, but I just think the leadership skills and the personality and the glue guy stuff and all those good things, I just think he's a guy to keep a focus on. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to mention him. And then the other players are A.J. Harris and Denai Dennis Sutton, and I think there may be one more. I'm not sure, but so it's a good group. And listen, hey, I want to really thank Penn State for having these availabilities. You know, James Franklin met with a few of us a couple years ago and said, what would the best way, what would help you guys in terms of doing coverage? And, you know, one of the things that was brought up from several reporters is having face-to-face access with players, even if it's after practice. And I think it's just been tremendous. And then making the coaches available was great. Making the transfer players available last week and A.J. Harris this week was great. So we've had a lot of good access this spring. And we didn't always have that, okay? And I think every once in a while, a lot of times people, including me, complain about access. But I think sometimes when things actually go right, you got to take a second and say, you know what, I appreciate this. So I do appreciate it, and I think most reporters appreciate the access that we've had.
Well, appreciate the great work you do, Mark. Thanks so much, and thanks for all the time today. Appreciate it, and good luck with the recycling.
Absolutely. You'll hear I'm glad it didn't rattle too much when we were on the air here, and I'll look forward to seeing you later at practice, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. The outstanding Mark Brennan, 247 Sports. We'll come back with more in a moment. Great to have you with us today.
Spring has sprung, and it's time to dust off those insurance policies. For over 100 years, the Purdy Insurance Agency has been protecting families and businesses of the greater Susquehanna Valley and beyond. With the experience of our trained and knowledgeable staff, you can rest assured that your needs will be evaluated and met by some of the industry's best representatives. No matter what your insurance needs are, call Purdy Insurance today at 570-286-5855 or visit our website at purdyinsurance.com to see what we can do for you.
Party time, game time, or just fun time. Doesn't matter what time it is because it's Brewers Outlet time. The beverage supermarket has the area's largest beer selection, imports, microbrews, ciders, and domestics. Pick from over 100 ice-cold 12-packs and dozens of 24-ounce singles. Soda, snacks, hot sauces, fresh roasted peanuts. Make it one-stop party shopping, and don't forget the pickle bar. So whatever you're celebrating or just doing it up, Brewers Outlet, Reagan Street, Sunbury wants to see you and thank you for your years of patronage.